Welcome back, everyone, to another book seminar within our monthly book seminar series organized by the Hague Program on International Cybersecurity. Within this monthly seminar series, we invite authors to present their recently published books on all matters relating to international cybersecurity and emerging technologies more broadly. My name is Isabella Brunner. I'm an assistant professor at the Institute of Security and Global Affairs at Leiden University and associate fellow at the Hague Program on International Cybersecurity. Today, I'm particularly delighted to welcome our very own Dr. Lise Andersen, who is a postdoctoral fellow here at the Hague Program on International Cybersecurity. And Lise will present her new book called Knowledge Management in Multilateral Diplomacy, the Case of the UN First Committee Cyber Negotiations. And you can already see the beautiful cover here as well. So Dr. Andersen obtained her PhD at University College London's Department of Science, Technology, Engineering and Public Policy. And in the past few years, Lise has published extensively on the management of knowledge informing multilateral diplomatic activity, specifically in the scientific and technological space. In addition, she has published frequently and worked on international cybersecurity issues, which makes her, I think, particularly well suited to speak about the issue of knowledge management at the UN First Committee cyber negotiations. With the UN cyber negotiations continuing through the new UN global mechanism and thus becoming more and more institutionalized, her analysis and findings on how knowledge is being managed there is becoming more and more important. Therefore, we're thrilled that she's joining us today in this book seminar to speak about her new book. So how this seminar goes is that Dr. Andersen, Lise, will present her book for around 35 minutes, after which we will have a Q&A session where you're all very welcome to ask questions or provide comments. And in order to do so, I would kindly ask you to either raise your hand, turn on your camera and ask your question directly, or if you prefer writing it in the chat, feel free to do that as well. And I'm happy to read out your question then. Just also as a note, the part where Lise will present is going to be recorded, but the questions and answers will not. So without further ado, I will now give the floor to you, Lise. Thank you very much for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Isabella, and hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be presenting my book today on, as Isabella introduced already, Knowledge Management in Multilateral Diplomacy, the Case of the UN First Committee Cyber Negotiations. Now, this work started out as my PhD thesis, and during the course of my postdoc here at Leiden University, I refined and extended the research, developing it into this monograph, which I've been fortunate enough to publish with Palgrave Macmillan in their series on studies in diplomacy and international relations. To set the scene for the study, this work was really a reaction to two observations concerning the expanding knowledge demands placed on contemporary diplomacy and the growing centrality of knowledge within increasingly complex systems of global governance. Previously, diplomatic practice focused predominantly on questions of sovereignty, war, and peace. However, globalization and digitization have transformed the nature of international problems, where diplomats now have to negotiate highly complex, multidisciplinary issues, which demand forms of expertise that these professionals were not traditionally expected to master, for instance, in areas as diverse as cybersecurity, climate change, space, and biotechnology. At the same time, knowledge growth is accelerating, specialization is intensifying, and the useful lifespan of knowledge is shrinking. And as a result, diplomats face growing difficulty in remaining adequately informed across the broad range of issues that they're having to negotiate. And this makes the question of how knowledge is managed in this professional context increasingly important. And this gains a particular pertinence in the context of the United Nations, as it functions as the central arena for multilateral decision-making, where states collectively negotiate how global problems are framed, understood, and addressed. And therefore, the way knowledge is managed within UN multilateral negotiations has direct implications for governance outcomes. It shapes which issues are prioritized, how problems are understood, and which solutions are ultimately considered and pursued. And as a result, the management of knowledge within UN diplomacy becomes increasingly consequential for how negotiation processes unfold, as well as for their broader impact on the international system. And to study this, I turned to the concept of knowledge management, which in its essence and historically speaking has always existed. People have safeguarded and transferred knowledge from one generation to the next always. Academically, however, knowledge management was developed as a concept in the business literature in the 1980s, alongside the growing recognition of knowledge as a central economic resource and a source of competitive advantage. At its core, knowledge management concerns capturing, sharing, and using knowledge effectively with the purpose of reducing knowledge loss, ensuring knowledge continuity, enhancing decision-making, prompting innovation, and fostering continuous improvement. Contextualized in the corporate environment, knowledge management can be understood as optimization of knowledge flows in support of effective decision-making, where, put simply, it is really about getting the right knowledge to the right people at the right time in a form that they can understand and apply within their specific professional context. And while the concept of knowledge management is widely studied and has taken expression in a wide range of industries, it has had a limited dialogue with the diplomatic profession in the literature. And so I decided to change that, as the concept offered a valuable lens for examining how knowledge is handled within complex multilateral negotiations at the UN. And so, the central question that drives the book is, to what extent and in what form have knowledge management practices been implemented to handle inputs contributed to UN multilateral negotiation processes? And by input, I refer to substantive contributions that shape negotiations, including, for example, expert contributions, national positions, and policy proposals that are provided with the aim of advancing agreement on the issues under discussion. And to explore this question empirically, I focused specifically on the UN First Committee cycle negotiations. Provide a brief overview of these negotiations for anyone unfamiliar with them. The discussions on developments in the field of information and telecommunications in the context of international security, as they have been formally known, were initiated in 1998 through a Russian-sponsored UN resolution which framed information technologies and indeed information itself as a security concern. In response, the issue was placed on the agenda of the UN First Committee, which focuses on issues of disarmament and international security, where the objective has since been to develop norms of responsible state behavior in cyberspace. Since their initiation, these discussions have evolved through 6 successive groups of governmental experts, or GGEs, and 2 open-ended working groups, with a permanent institutional mechanism now being established on the topic. In terms of outcomes, 4 out of the 6 GGEs and both of the open-ended working groups have produced consensus reports, which have established and gradually elaborated 11 voluntary norms of responsible state behavior. A key feature of the progression of these discussions has been the development of distinct knowledge environments across the different negotiation formats. And this is particularly evident in the contrasting institutional structures and level of openness that characterizes the GGEs and the open-ended working groups. On the one hand, the GGEs have been limited in membership, conducted off the record, behind closed doors, and with restricted access to documentation, and only the mandating and outcome documents made publicly available. On the other hand, the open-ended working groups were open to all UN member states, allowed participation from accredited non-state actors, and made proceedings and documents publicly accessible. And taken together, these contrasting institutional formats provided a useful setting for examining how inputs have been managed in support of diplomats working to address a very complex international issue. And this was especially the case given the fact that an explicit policy or strategy for systematically managing inputs contributed to these discussions had not been formally articulated. That was not to say, however, that knowledge management practices have not been undertaken implicitly within these negotiations. even if they've not been explicitly labeled as such. And this was the assumption from which the study proceeded, which in turn raised the question of how do you identify knowledge management practices that might be present in the negotiations. And with this in mind, the book has 3 objectives. First, to identify any practices that could be conceptualized as acts of knowledge management in the negotiations. Second, to characterize the overall approach that has then been taken to knowledge management given any identified practices. And third, to analyze how these practices have evolved as the discussions have progressed over time. And to reach these objectives, I adopted and adapted a knowledge management model developed by Professor Xiaofeng Liu of Plymouth University in the UK, where this model effectively breaks down the concept of knowledge management into 5 distinct stages characterized by particular practices and which operate in sequence. And these practices consist of knowledge building, knowledge validation, knowledge holding, knowledge mobilization, and finally knowledge utilization. And to apply this model and identify any KM practices, I first deconstructed and then reconstructed the negotiations into their individual parts through process mapping, which was complemented by desk research, elite interviews, and non-participant observation. And so, stage by stage and chapter by chapter, the book reveals what form knowledge management practices have taken in the context of the UN First Committee cyber negotiations. And it starts with the first stage, which concerns knowledge building. And this involves expanding the knowledge base, which is the foundation upon which work is conducted and any decisions are based of the professional context in question. And knowledge building can occur through several processes, including knowledge creation, acquisition, and capture, where knowledge creation refers to the generation of new knowledge. Knowledge acquisition concerns obtaining knowledge already in existence, but not accessible to those who require it. And knowledge capture involves adapting or repurposing existing knowledge for use in a new context. And these different forms of knowledge building are not mutually exclusive and can occur simultaneously. When considering knowledge building in the cyber negotiations, it has occurred continuously throughout the lifetime of the process and across both formal and informal spaces. Centrally, no permanent institutional mechanism specifically designed to expand or maintain the knowledge base of the negotiations has been formally established. Rather, knowledge building has been driven largely by the initiative and the efforts of negotiation participants themselves. And it's ultimately them who have curated the knowledge base of these negotiations. Diplomats have been responsible for seeking out, interpreting, and contributing relevant knowledge to the discussions, which has occurred primarily through 2 broad types of activity: interpersonal interaction and engagement with material resources. Interpersonally, negotiators have enhanced their knowledge through, for instance, formal exchanges on the negotiation floor, expert briefings, informal consultations, and bilateral multilateral meetings. And at the same time, participants have also relied on material resources, including, for example, national submissions and working papers. Considering these practices, knowledge building has occurred primarily through acquisition and capture rather than direct creation, where existing expertise, positions, and interpretations were brought into the negotiations, adapted to the diplomatic context, and progressively refined through interaction over time. Having examined how knowledge is built, the focus then shifts to how it is validated before being added to the knowledge base. And specifically, this next stage in the knowledge management process concerns the scrutiny of newly acquired knowledge. Before knowledge can be used, it must be assessed in terms of its quality, relevance, and legitimacy. And after this initial scrutinization process, knowledge validation remains relevant and takes on a second function, which involves ensuring that accepted knowledge remains accurate and reflective of changing realities. And this is particularly important because knowledge is not static. It evolves over time, and certain elements may become outdated, less relevant, or even misleading if left unexamined. And in this sense, maintaining all available knowledge without reevaluation can become inefficient or counterproductive, while the removal, revision, or updating of knowledge can be just as consequential as its acquisition. As a result, knowledge validation also involves the careful regulation of changes to the knowledge base, ensuring that any modification is deliberate, justified, and aligned with its intended purposes. Within the cyber negotiations, knowledge validation has not occurred through a formalized or centralized review mechanism. There's no impartial third party or designated UN authority that has been tasked with systematically verifying, assessing, or evaluating the substantive inputs provided to the process. And this is not necessarily surprising given the political character of many of the contributed inputs. However, knowledge validation was still found to occur, taking place through a set of implicit practices embedded within the negotiation process. And these practices can be grouped into three main forms: validation by association or proxy, validation through personal expertise, and validation through political acceptance. Validation by association or proxy involves drawing legitimacy from external sources of authority, and this includes referencing outputs from recognized expert communities, academic work, or reputable international bodies. And in this sense, validation is partly outsourced to trusted epistemic communities whose credibility is assumed to extend into the negotiation context. The second form of validation is through personal expertise. Here, diplomats and institutional actors rely on their own accumulated experience and personal knowledge to evaluate the credibility of incoming information. And this introduces a more situational and experience-based form of judgment into the validation process. The third form is political validation, which differs from the other two in that it's not primarily concerned with factual accuracy. Instead, it concerns whether knowledge inputs are politically acceptable, strategically useful, and compatible with national interests. And taken together, these forms of validation illustrate that knowledge is not formally certified within the system, but rather legitimized through a combination of epistemic authority, professional judgment, and political agreement on an ongoing basis. And among these, consensus functions as the ultimate expression of collective validation within the negotiation process, as accepted knowledge is ultimately embedded in negotiation outcome documents. After knowledge has been validated, it must be organized and retained. And this brings us to knowledge holding, which refers to the means through which validated knowledge is structured and stored to allow for its future use and retrieval. This stage is essential for ensuring both the preservation as well as accessibility of knowledge in any given professional context. And I should note here that in the case of the cyber negotiation, it's not only been validated knowledge that has been stored, but broader contributions offered to the negotiation process due to the dynamics or the specific dynamics of this professional context. When looking at the cyber negotiations, knowledge holding is not organized through a comprehensive or centralized institutional system. There's no single facility or mechanism that systematically stores, organizes, and maintains all material generated through and for the negotiation process. Instead, knowledge holding occurs in a dispersed and partly informal manner across multiple channels via different mediums. These include written documentation and audiovisual recordings stored on UN platforms, as well as the experiential memory of individuals who've participated in successive rounds of the negotiations. In addition, non-state actors have also at times contributed to the preservation and accessibility of material related to the process. And taken together, these practices indicate that knowledge holding has been both intentional and unintentional. While some material is formally archived, a significant portion has been retained through tacit and individual means rather than by institutional design. And this fragmented structure has had an important consequence. In particular, it has contributed to uneven access to information and the development of knowledge asymmetries between process veterans and newcomers to the negotiations. And in certain cases, this has allowed certain actors to retain and leverage historical insight that has not been equally available to all participants. So overall, knowledge holding in these negotiations has been dispersed. It's been partly institutionalized, and it's been heavily dependent on both formal documentation and informal retention by individuals and external actors. Building on the previous stage of knowledge holding, it's not sufficient for knowledge simply to be stored or retained within a professional context. For knowledge to become useful, it must also be accessible and able to circulate to those in need of it. Knowledge mobilization, therefore, refers to a process through which knowledge is transmitted from where it is held or stored to where it is applied in practice. And in this sense, it represents the movement of knowledge. Critically, knowledge mobilization is not automatic. It's shaped by the structure of the underlying knowledge holding arrangements, including how accessible, transparent, and interpretable the stored knowledge is for relevant actors. And as a result, the effectiveness of knowledge mobilization is highly dependent on the design and usability of the knowledge holding system in which it is embedded. And that is exactly what we see in the cyber negotiations. As knowledge has been stored through documents, audiovisual recordings, as well as through experiential memory of process participants and non-state actors, its transmission has taken place through a combination of individual initiatives in consulting available resources and interpersonal interaction. And this reflects a close relationship between knowledge building and mobilization. A central role in fostering knowledge mobilization has been played by the chairs of the GGE and open-ended working group processes who've actively facilitated the flow of knowledge. And they have done so, for example, by managing interventions and drawing on input from member states, members of the support teams and non-state actors. And in this way, they have functioned as key intermediaries in ensuring that knowledge is brought into and circulated within the negotiation process. At the same time, knowledge mobilization has also been shaped by what can be described as non-mobilization practices. And these include time constraints on interventions, limits on participation, and restrictions placed on certain actors. And while often introduced for procedural proficiency and to support the negotiation process, these practices can also restrict the circulation of knowledge and limit those whose input is available to the discussions. So overall, knowledge mobilization in these negotiations can be understood as an ecosystem of knowledge transmission that is shaped both by enabling and constraining practices and dependent on the interaction between institutional design and individual agency. On to the last stage of the model applied, knowledge utilization refers to the stage in which the knowledge that has been managed is actively used in practice. This involves using knowledge to solve problems, inform decision-making, influence actions, or shape behavior, for example. And it's at this point that the managed knowledge actually becomes an operational asset that is actively deployed within a given professional context. More broadly, effective knowledge utilization ensures that work is carried out in an informed and appropriate manner based on the best available information. Within the cyber negotiations, knowledge utilization is most clearly visible in the production of formal outcome documents, including the GGE and open-ended working group consensus reports, as well as the annual progress reports of the second open-ended working group, which represent the tangible outputs of the negotiations. And a central feature of this stage is the iterative translation of diverse contributions into draft language. And this involves collecting, combining, and editing inputs into coherent text, followed by repeated rounds of revision. And this work is primarily carried out by the chairs, their support teams, and the secretariat, who draw on feedback from member states to shape evolving drafts. A key finding here is then that language itself becomes the main tool and resource of knowledge utilization. The drafting process is not simply about recording contributions, but about selecting and shaping language that can achieve convergence and ultimately support consensus among member states. And this often involves careful wording or wordsmithing to ensure that agreed formulations remain stable over time and are not reopened for later negotiation. Because these processes are consensus-based, only those inputs that are politically acceptable to all parties can be fully utilized in final texts. And as a result, knowledge utilization in this context is shaped less by technical or scientific considerations and more by political feasibility and alignment with national interests. And this means that not all contributions are reflected equally in final outcome reports. Some inputs are incorporated into agreed language, while others are omitted or deferred if consensus cannot be reached. And in cases where consensus breaks down entirely, no utilization in the final sense occurs, as seen in instances where negotiation processes fail to produce an agreed report. Moreover, the findings highlight that knowledge utilization is not evenly distributed across actors. While member states actively control what can be included in the consensus outputs, it has been the chairs and support teams who actively operationalize utilization by transforming inputs into structured text. Non-state actors, while able to contribute, have not been directly able to determine how or whether their input is actually reflected in final agreements. So ultimately, knowledge utilization in these negotiations is best understood as a politically constrained, language-driven process of synthesis that culminates in consensus-based documents rather than a direct or a neutral application of knowledge. So, overall, although a formal knowledge management strategy had not been articulated for the cyber negotiations, knowledge management practices were nonetheless identifiable within them, having emerged implicitly rather than by explicit design. And these practices have not been confined to the formal negotiation sessions themselves. Instead, they've been undertaken in both formal and informal spaces related to the discussions, including during the intersessional periods, at side events, and also at informal meetings. In other words, knowledge management in this professional context has developed a life beyond the formal workflow of the negotiations themselves. Interestingly, there has been no single actor that has functioned as the central knowledge manager. Rather, a range of actors, member states, the chairs, support teams, process veterans, and non-state actors, have all carried out different knowledge management functions. And as a result, the knowledge management approach within these negotiations can be understood as highly dispersed. It's also revealed that the sequencing of these practices did not follow the neat linear progression suggested by the model applied. Certain activities occurred continuously and simultaneously throughout the negotiations, and this suggests that the approach taken was unsystematic rather than strategically coordinated. Further, many practices actually fulfilled multiple knowledge management functions at once. For example, the same interaction could simultaneously build and mobilize knowledge, and this overlap highlights that in practice, the practices associated with the different stages are often intertwined and actually difficult to separate clearly. So ultimately, the approach to knowledge management within the cyber negotiations can therefore be characterized as implicit, dispersed, unsystematic, and somewhat messy. However, it has evolved over time, particularly in the transition from the GGE to the open-ended working group format. Under the GGE format, there was little explicit attention given to knowledge management. As mentioned earlier, the negotiations were closed door, off the record, temporary in nature, with minimal institutional record keeping beyond the final reports. Combined with high staff turnover, this creates a significant knowledge loss and a weak institutional memory. Despite this, informal knowledge management practices still emerged, initially through the process veterans retaining and transferring tacit knowledge. A major shift did, however, occur with the introduction of the open-ended working group format. By opening participation to all UN member states and to some non-state actors, the negotiations placed a far greater emphasis on knowledge building and mobilization. More sessions, more intersessional meetings, and broader participation created substantially more opportunity for information exchange, learning, and engagement. And at the same time, a wider community of practice developed around the negotiations, particularly among non-state actors. And these actors have helped states build capacity, they've supported understandings of the issues under discussion, and facilitated greater participation in the process through side events, workshops, and informal engagement. The open-ended working group format has also strengthened knowledge validation and transparency. public live streaming, the release of draft reports, broader participation has all allowed a much wider range of actors to scrutinize, assess, and contribute to the discussions than was possible under the GGE model. And moreover, significant progress has also been made in knowledge holding, where unlike the GGEs, the open-ended working groups generated extensive digital records, including documents and audiovisual archives. And this has made the institutional memory of the negotiations more substantive, more accessible, and less dependent on the recollections of long-term participants. In terms of knowledge utilization practices, they have remained relatively consistent, continuing to evolve around synthesizing inputs into draft text and through iterative editing. But the process has become more visible and transparent under the open-ended working group, with additional outputs, such as the annual progress reports, expanding the range of negotiation products being produced. So overall, the evolution from the GGE to the open-ended working group reflects a gradual movement towards a more substantial and increasingly systematic approach to knowledge management. It's still implicit, dispersed, and a bit messy, but the negotiations demonstrate a clear procedural progress towards a more intentional and institutionalized approach. So having considered the case of the UN First Committee negotiations, it becomes clear that knowledge management practices have implicitly developed in the multilateral context. And this creates an opportunity for the UN to take a much more intentional and structured role as a knowledge manager across its multilateral processes. Rather than leaving knowledge management to evolve organically, the UN could actively build on practices that already exist and strengthen them through a more deliberate approach. And this is particularly timely in the context of the cyber negotiations, as they are, as mentioned, moving towards institutionalization at the moment. And a first step to do this is to consolidate existing knowledge infrastructure. At present, in this case, input related to the negotiations is spread across multiple platforms, where the UN could instead prioritize a single centralized repository that captures all negotiation-related material in a structured, accessible, chronological, and continuously updated way. And this would significantly strengthen the institutional memory and reduce the fragmentation of knowledge. Beyond storage, the UN could also play a more active role in knowledge production and exchange, for example, by embedding dedicated research capacity within the Secretariat to support member states, especially those with limited resources, and facilitate a more systematic knowledge building mobilization approach between negotiation sessions. In relation to non-state actors, the UN is also well placed to further institutionalize their engagement. Rather than ad hoc participation, structured consultative mechanisms could be integrated into the architecture of the future process, ensuring that their expertise is consistently and transparently drawn upon where useful, noting that this is a particularly sensitive topic in these particular negotiations. At the same time, knowledge validation and utilization could be made more explicit in outcome processes. Future reports could include clearer explanations of how inputs were used and why certain elements were included, enhancing transparency, legitimacy, and institutional learning over time, while still safeguarding and respecting the political sensitivities and positions of participating actors. Taken together, these steps would not require a radical overhaul. Instead, they would involve strengthening and joining up practices that already exist and embed them more deliberately into the design of future processes. So, moving beyond the case examined in the book, it's important to consider these findings, or what they suggest more broadly, where UN multilateral negotiation processes each operate in their own distinct political and thematic context. However, they're also embedded within broadly similar procedural frameworks, which means that there is likely to be a degree of comparability in how knowledge management practices emerge across different negotiation settings. And this is particularly relevant given Knowledge management in UN multilateral negotiations is not currently guided by a central institutional policy, meaning that practices are shaped largely at the level of individual negotiation processes, should they exist. And this means that the book does more than describe a single case. It offers a methodological and conceptual approach that can be used as a reference point for analyzing other UN negotiation processes, while the findings offer empirical insight into what knowledge management practices may be operating more broadly across the UN system. So I think it shows also the value of drawing upon another discipline, the business literature in particular, and yeah, it contributes to a wider understanding of how knowledge is managed in multilateral diplomacy, which is particularly critical at a time when the operational environment of 21st century diplomacy is becoming increasingly complex. And on that note, I will stop and say thank you for listening. Should you be interested, the book is available open access here at the link, where I should probably say with thanks to UKRI's Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, who have funded both my PhD and open access. So that's it.